Hello, my fellow human beings. Today, I'm excited to introduce to you an incredible company, an organization that is attempting to do something that is unfathomably difficult, and yet completely necessary for the survival of our species in an uncertain future. The question is, how do we feed all people on Earth, no matter what? Today, I had a conversation with Aron Mill, Team Coordinator and Research Associate for the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters, or ALLFED. ALLFED seeks out to identify various resilient food solutions and help governments and companies implement these solutions to feed everyone in the event of a global catastrophe. In their research, they refer to abrupt light reduction scenarios, such as, for example, supervolcanic eruptions, which could deplete food supplies or access to 5% of the global population or more, resulting in almost instantaneous mass starvation. ALLFED finds their solutions in resilient food solutions, which are technologies and systems that can help everyone survive a global catastrophe that shocks the world's food systems. Their ultimate goal is to feed everyone, no matter what. Let's find out how that is even possible. Thank you for listening to Type 1 Planet. Please take this episode or take this podcast and share it with people who you think would be like-minded and be interested in the topics. Visit us on social media at Type 1 Planet, and visit us on our website at type1planet.net.
All right, hello and welcome to the Type 1 Planet podcast. I'm Robert Roach, and I'm joined by our guest today, Aron Mill, Team Coordinator and Research Associate at the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters, or ALLFED. Aron, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So ALLFED seeks to identify various resilient food solutions. We want to help governments and companies implement these solutions so you could feed everyone in the event of a global catastrophe. And I think your organization commonly refers to these events that deplete the food supply as abrupt sunlight reduction scenarios. So, there's an example from your website,
Correct.
Supervolcanic explosions. Describe what these kinds of events actually look like. What does it do to our Earth and our food supply and our civilization?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So let's start with supervolcanic eruptions. A result of such a volcanic eruption would be that a lot of soot and or sulfate aerosols would be launched into the higher layers of the atmosphere. Depending on the size of the eruption, it would go to different layers. And the problem is, you can see if it tens of kilometers high, it doesn't rain down anymore, right? So the problem would be that we have a literal darkening of the sky. And as a result, here less sunlight will come down to the surface of the Earth, and that will lead to a cooling effect and will obviously naturally impact photosynthesis of crops. So this is already a huge impact on our agriculture and ability to produce food. And in addition to that, this could also impact how the weather functions. So there's climate models that show that precipitation is disrupted severely. We might get less rain, so you can see how our agriculture, where we don't have artificial irrigation, will be disrupted as well, areas that are dependent on rain. So this could last for several years, depending on the size and the amount erupted. So the size of the eruption and the amount of, say, sulfates that reach high into the atmosphere. And this then, as a consequence, could lead to widespread food insecurity or potentially global famine in the worst cases.
Okay. And do we have any historical examples that we pull from research, or has this happened in a time when we were able to collect data on it?
Yeah, great question. So we have a smaller example. So in 1815, we had the volcano Tambora in the Philippines erupt, which caused several kinds of disruptions. So on the one side, it messed with the monsoon patterns for India. I think it caused weather disruptions and famines across East Asia. But also, where I'm a bit more familiar with is Central Europe. So here in Germany, where I'm from, we had the year without the summer in 1816. So there are reports say for like a warm summer month, like June or July, where it literally rained like more than 25 days of the month. So, and we had, a gray sky, raining all the time, led to widespread crop failure, a lot of deaths from famine. And to give like an historic anecdote here, Mary Shelley, the author of the book Frankenstein, actually, through that time, if I recall correctly, she and her friends wanted to do like a holiday in their like summer residency in the Swiss Alps. And yeah, on the way there, they saw a lot of people starving left and right, potentially already a few dead. And while they were there, they were kind of locked in. So because it was raining the whole time, sometimes even hailing, despite it being in the summer. So as a pastime, they told each other ghost stories in front of the fireplace. And legend has it that is where the story of Frankenstein emerged. So that is like a very recent example.
That's fascinating.
But in addition, yeah, it's very interesting. I can really recommend the book, The Year Without Summer. But also, like, this was not a supervolcanic eruption so these effects were global, but like the larger scale effects were more regionalized. So this, for example, did not spread the whole way, say, to North America. I think there was like a cold front at the East Coast, but nothing that would lead to, say, widespread food insecurity and famines. But we do have, from the climate record, more examples where large-scale volcanic eruptions are tied to cold periods or potential ice ages. So this is like going back into like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or potentially even millions of years.
And, there's a likelihood associated on your website and in your research with these kinds of scenarios. There's also the large asteroidal impact. There's the supervolcano, and I think the asteroidal impact's like a 10,000% or something, and the supervolcano is a 100%, and then there's nuclear, which is astoundingly 1% probability a year, or something like that. How do these percentages affect ALLFED's strategy? Do you address nuclear winter as a priority over supervolcano strategy? Are they different in some way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, obviously, our like likelihood of or the perceived likelihood of the forecast will impact what we prioritize. But in this specific case, as you mentioned earlier, we talk about the category of abrupt sunlight reduction scenarios, right? That is the three things that all of these events, nuclear war leading to nuclear winter, supervolcanic eruptions leading to a volcanic winter, or an asteroid impact with a similar effect, they have in common is that the impact is like the darkening of the skies to a certain degree, and therefore an impact on agriculture. So the solutions look, or in these scenarios, are very similar, if not the same, at least from a first principle perspective. Yeah.
Okay, got it. So let's talk a little bit about those solutions. So there's a term that you use a lot, resilient food solutions. So what is a resilient food solution? How do you define that?
Yeah, thank you. So resilient food solutions have different kind of characteristics. So first of all, they need to be scalable and like rapidly scalable. And or a second criteria would be they need to be independent of traditional agriculture inputs. And ideally, being affordable all the way through. Because if we already look at the world today, right, there's a lot of food insecurity, even though we produce enough food, which is linked to affordability as well. So to give an example here, what would be a food that could be scaled very quickly? That might be seaweed. So because for seaweed farms, we've got the ocean. It's vast. We wouldn't need less than 1% of the ocean area to potentially feed the world, right, in calories, which we wouldn't do directly. But say a low-tech seaweed farm, you can imagine, is basically a floating rope structure from which the seaweed grows. and swims. That is something that's very scalable. We have the technology. It's already being done in like Indonesia and China. They have large-scale seaweed farms. So that's one food solution, right? It could be a small part of our diet that is very scalable and fairly cheap, affordable. Another example would be single-cell proteins. So what are single-cell proteins? You can imagine they're like bacteria feasting, say, on methane or hydrogen, and that we can turn into like a powder, which is almost pure protein. We are already producing this today. It's being mostly used as a fish feed. So, but it's safe to consume, or there are versions of it that are safe to consume. And that doesn't rely, say, on, well, the sun directly, right? So these are examples of resilient food solutions.
Okay, got it. And are the seaweed crops not reliant on the sun, or is it just to a much lower degree?
Yeah, great question. So, to a much lower degree is kind of the correct answer in this case. So we have taken growth models and we see that seaweed is not being limited by the amount of sunlight hitting the earth, or in this case, I guess, the ocean area. It's mostly limited by nutrient availability. So that's also where you can see, for example, seaweed growing to like 10 meters below the ocean surface, right? Where a lot of sunlight is already being reduced, or absorbed by the water itself. It's highly efficient in their photosynthetic process.
There's another term I saw somewhere, I think in the paper that you sent me, referring to cold crops. What are cold crops?
Yeah. So these are a very important type of crop when we talk about resilient food solutions, because in these abrupt sunlight reduction scenarios we talked about, one of the biggest impact on agriculture is the cooling down of the atmosphere, or just like the general global cooling that will take place. And therefore we will get nights of frost in larger areas than we would have gotten before. And for example, if you take a potato, a great crop, I love it. A potato crop doesn't mind or does not die if there's a single night of frost, to give an example. So generally, cold-tolerant crops will be very important in such a scenario. And one thing we are looking into, how could we relocate crops, say, from higher latitudes closer to the equator, where they, in this kind of scenario, would feel or would flourish more. To give another example, there are types of weeds. There's, for example, like spring wheat or summer wheat or like winter wheat, and they have different tolerances regarding to temperature. So we're looking into these and see which grow under which conditions.
Okay, got it. That seemed when you say you relocating a crop from a northern latitude down more close to the equator, are you referring to actually beginning production of that crop closer to the equator, or finding ways to just increase the amount that's being created in northern latitude and then shipping it down?
So that's a great question, and I can connect you more there with a colleague who's leading that project. That's not a research project I've been involved with or like that deeply, but it's generally there's like several approaches how you could do this, right? But ideally, getting the seeds into climates where they would grow well, right? Like what are the challenges behind that? How can we train new people to do this? This is like all work that we're interested in at ALLFED.
So, and then the last thing I saw in your paper as kind of another sort of technology that you're looking into is greenhouse cropping and making that somehow more scalable or more efficient. What does that technology look like in your models?
Yeah, that's like very related to the cold tolerant crops, because greenhouses in general keep the temperature a bit more than an open field, say overnight, and therefore might reduce the amount of frost the crops will experience. And one thing we've looked into is how could we quickly scale the amount of greenhouses we have available, right? Like the lowest tech version of that is having like plastic sheets, like thin film, covering the farms. And yeah, in one of the papers we did, we looked at like what are the material constraints to say produce 1 million square kilometers of greenhouses, right? Like this isn't hypothetical, but this would be very crucial, and we would ideally generate new areas of farm area that we can use and where we can grow these crops.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that's basically
yeah, absolutely. It's really fascinating. I had I'm getting to have these sorts of conversations more about what can we do in terms of crop failure, and also kind of finding better ways to create enough food. I had a amazing conversation with an episode that will have been out by the time yours is out, called with a guy named Christopher Udall, and Christopher, he's a big venture capitalist in the ag tech and then also space agriculture, and it's fascinating because he's basically his company Hudson Alpha is creating methods where they can grow crops, vast amounts of crops in space, and it's actually more feasible to just drop the crop down in the location, or it's cheaper to drop the crop in the location, like a city, in Boston, versus shipping that crop from California to Boston. It's cheaper and it uses less because all you're using is gravity. So it would be pretty fascinating maybe to get someone from your organization together with him to talk about like, okay, what does this look like? Is it even possible in a low light scenario that you're referring to?
Yeah, that sounds interesting, but I haven't heard of it yet.
Okay, all right.
So I'm looking forward to that episode.
I'll send. Oh, sorry, I just lost you for a second visually. All right, there you go. So the research page on your website is fascinating. I highly advise everyone to head over to the ALLFED website. There's I could.
Yeah, I guess for audience here, it's just like www.allfed.info.
There. Okay, perfect. Thank you, and I'll include that in the show notes. I want to dive into. I want to create an episode on every one of these bullets, but there's a lot of kind of different things that I'm interested in. One is, in terms of the research, you mentioned some cool technologies like the single cellular, methane consuming protein, and then, some other, the seaweed technology. What other kind of ideas are happening? You're working on getting calories and nutrients from plants and humans for humans from plants that we typically can't digest, such as leaves or wood or something like that. What does that process look like? Is there more projects in the work to see, okay, well, what else can we potentially eat if we were to manipulate it in some way?
Yeah, we're always keeping an eye out for solutions of that regards. I know there are like grants out there to like synthesize food, basically speaking, out of thin air with added water. But yeah, one example you just mentioned there, like how to turn wood into food. It's also quite an interesting process. So shall I briefly go into that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So the idea is that, plant fibers, wood is mostly like cellulosic connections. And if you break that down, you can turn that into sugar. So with certain enzymes, you can like basically create sugar from that. And for example, ruminants like cows, that's why they can eat like plant fibers, because they have these kind of enzymes in their guts. So what we can do, which is like very interesting for these kind of catastrophes, these like sudden abrupt shocks to our food system, we could actually retrofit plant and paper factories, because they have a lot in common of the machinery needed to do that. They have already all the machinery in place to like really grind down the plant fibers into like a pulp. And then we, in a sense, have to only add a bioreactor with the enzymes that then breaks down this mush out of cellulosic fiber, and out comes sugar. This is obviously a simplified overview, but this is a source of calories that we could use. And in these scenarios, we would have a lot of dead trees that we could then use to gain additional food production.
Wow. Now, when you're thinking about these models, these potential scenarios, I would imagine you'd have to create food combinations. You would have to have, all right, this is our source of sugar, this is our source of protein. Are there other, what do we need a source of like another kind of thing that's very important for our bodies? Do we have a full picture yet of everything that the body needs in this scenario? Like in the Matrix, they're eating the sludge. He's like, it's everything the body needs. It tastes like tasty weed or whatever.
Yes, great. Last year, colleagues of mine have published a paper in that direction, looking not only at the macronutrients, so that would be fat, proteins, and carbohydrates, but also at the micronutrients and like checking, okay, from the proteins, is it actually like the complete protein profile, right? I think we need like on the order of like 12 amino acids to build out all the proteins that we need in our body. I don't have a nutritious background, so please don't quote me directly on this. We're doing work into that. And it looks like that the resilient foods, like the catalog that we are proposing at ALLFED and that we have investigated so far, can be combined in such a way that it would be a complete diet. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And all right, so let's just think about this theoretically. So we're prepared in such a way where, does it look like that ALLFED would kind of create a protocol? Okay, for each government, you return your paper mills to do this and start pulling sugars out of the wood. We'll use these kind of facilities to do this. Bring everything together. We'll create protein bars or whatever it is, and start distributing that to your population. Is that kind of like a set of instructions that you're providing, or are you setting up, facilities around the world that could potentially do this kind of work? What's the long-term vision here?
Yeah, great question. So ALLFED's long-term mission is to feed everyone no matter what. And that is, that's like quite the ambitious high bar, right? No single person or organization can achieve such an objective. But what we're trying to do is inspire work in that direction, inspire collaboration. We hope that with the work ALLFED is doing, we're contributing towards that global effort that allows everyone to be fat no matter what. But how does that look like? Yeah, it can take several avenues. So we are creating country response plans. We have started doing that recently, where it takes into account how much of which industries the countries have. But that is like a very specific problem, right? Like ideally, the long-term plan would be that there's like surge capacity in place, that there's say policies in place that in case of emergency, industries know that they need to retrofit, or they are briefed and there have been like training or scenario exercises how to respond to these kind of shocks. To give one example, at the start of 2020, when COVID came around and it was clear it would become a global thing, we saw a lot of breweries suddenly producing hand sanitizer because they already had, most of the infrastructure in place to work with alcoholics, and disinfectants are like very similar, right? So that is something we have seen. That's part of what we would like to see as well, and have these plans in place. But I can expand on that a lot, like how this future could look like, what a more resilient world would look like. But I wonder where we want to go now.
We're going to get there. A big kind of question that I have in my mind when, I hear your mission to feed everyone no matter what is, there's a question first of creating the substance that people can eat. But then the second question is the logistical supply chain ramifications. You have a catastrophic event I could totally see our supply chain breaking down in such a way where, distributing these materials and getting regions to actually share resources with each other would be extremely difficult. So is this are you building this into your models and your questioning as an organization?
Yeah, this is a very important aspect of the mission, feeding everyone no matter what. We have been mostly done research in the side of how to produce food. Let me briefly explain why and then come back to the supply chains. Because there are like a lot of scenarios. One we talked earlier about is the supervolcanic eruptions, where global supply chains would not be directly disrupted, right? We could think of a remote volcano erupting, but having a global impact on the climate. So in that scenario, we would have the capacity in place to collaborate, to trade, to work together. And yeah, our research has shown at ALLFED that yes, we can feed everyone if we work together. So this is definitely something we encourage and want to inspire. So good governance along the lines of not banning food imports or exports is very important. This is also something that we want to see expanded, right? Like proper resources, finances, and time need to go in this area of supply chains.
And I would imagine education and awareness around the reality of, of what one of these low light scenarios and the probability of it is something that you have to do. You have to reach out to these governments or these, these different just governing bodies and educate them about, okay, this is a possibility, and you kind of have to build this into your disaster planning. Do you have a team that's working with politicians to just really kind of be like, hey, you have to kind of think about this?
Yes, so we have colleagues within the team. I'm happy to connect you there with them and have a follow-up, maybe second episode if you're interested in that. I've been less on the outreach side. I've been more the academic and team organization side. But yeah, this is key that this gets, first of all, acknowledged as a risk, these abrupt scenarios, because say if we were talking about something where people don't think it's possible or likely to happen within, say, an election period or within this decade, the chances are rare that it will be included, say, in a risk report or there will be a budget for that. But work has been growing, right? Through COVID, a lot of governments around the world have learned that global disruptions can happen and that there are systemic risk and cascading risks, which we can briefly go into what those terms mean, present. And so yeah, outreach is definitely an important thing. And yeah, we want to make sure these risks are understood. To give maybe an extreme example here, for example, the UK has roughly, if I recall correctly, 2 weeks worth of food storage across the country, because most of their food is being imported and in transportation. So if there, say, would be a major supply chain disruption, that would have key impacts for the UK. So yeah, this needs to be acknowledged as a risk and needs to be looked into and prepared for.
And there's just to bring it back to kind of vulnerabilities, I saw on your website that technology, our society's advanced and progresses in a huge way, but many of our innovations have also created vulnerabilities. And the UK here is super vulnerable in terms of its completely dependent on its logistical supply chain. So what are these? Are there other vulnerabilities outside of supply chains? And how can we shore up our technological infrastructure to address these weak points?
Yeah, great. So yeah, let's first look at the risk and then potentially solutions here. So, well, let me start with one point. I think we're already doing a great job to some degree. We have established a great trade network across the world, which led to like a lot of efficiency gains through specialization, which had tremendous impacts around the world, or like in terms of like health standards, like life expectancy at birth, right? And so that's great. But obviously, or like directly from that, we can see, yeah, but if those trade networks would be disrupted, we would lose those benefits, and we might not be able, say, in our own country or whatever regional scale you want to look at to provide everything we need for the society to function. But yeah, let's go briefly talk about all the areas which are like key for modern civilization to work. So we've got electricity, communication systems. Then we have for the electricity different sources, right? It's like it might be oil and gas, but also solar and the power grid itself as critical infrastructure. Then we got like radio towers, the internet. We have our banking system. A lot of things work based on that, and our water supply, which is linked to our energy supply. So there's a lot of interdependency, and therefore there's a systemic risk here at play. So a systemic risk is like when the risk of a breakdown of like an entire system is possible instead of just like, say, a simple breakdown of an individual part or a failure of an individual part. And then we can have cascading impacts.
Yeah, and my episode with Anders Sandberg, who is on the he's on the board of ALLFED, is that correct? Yeah.
Correct.
Yep.
Anders Sandberg is a board member at the Alliance to Feed the Earth and Disasters.
Yeah, awesome. And
great episode.
Thank you. Cheers. Yeah, he talks about this a lot. You know, it can start with a logistical. We saw it in COVID. Logistical supply chain issue is leading to food even minor food insecurity, where prices start to go up. That can lead to social unrest, which can lead to this, which can lead to that. And then you sprinkle a little global warming on top of that, and it gets worse, and things can kind of cascade out of control. Is that the kind of scenario that you're referring to?
Yes, exactly. And yeah, you asked earlier about solutions. So how would a more resilient system look like? Or how could generally like the technology that enables the civilization we enjoy right now, how could that be made more resilient? So on the one side, we need strategic stockpiles. So you could see that a lot of our they're like key transformers, for example, that are key parts of our power grid. And we could have like an unplugged transformer right next to one that's at work right now. And in case something breaks down there, right, it might be like something we are also looking into are like loss of industry scenarios, not only quote unquote loss of sun scenarios, where say a solar storm might disrupt such devices, right? And it's like good to have backup systems. That might be a thing. Or generally having more preparedness planning, right? A lot of stakeholders or key actors of a society knowing what to do and having done scenario exercises, how to respond, how to get critical infrastructure running again. And yeah, the technology development's also key part of these resilient food solutions that we talked earlier, right? Like, have we developed them in such a way that they're like quickly scalable with that technology in mind? So for example, the single cell protein might be nowadays technology where there are like a lot of unique facilities producing it, right? Like each company having their own approach. But say if you want like a blueprint for like build hundreds of these facilities, right? Like across different regions around the world. Do we have that in case? Or did we get like test runs? Say almost like an army exercise of like, let's deploy a large area of seaweed farms and see how much food we can produce over one season, right? Like there's a lot to learn in this case. And I guess the last thing, a bit more, or like two more things. A bit more on the general side, just building scenario planning and foresight capacities in our governmental institutions, having a bit more longer term plans, more forecasting. So this is not an easy task, but I would argue a very important one, or we at ALLFED would argue that that is quite important. And a solution that I didn't talk that much about yet because the trade-offs are not quite clear are decentralization, right? So we could imagine, okay, well, I guess each country being self-sufficient might be more resilient to certain types of shocks. But there's a trade-off, right? Like we've gained a lot from the trade that we have right now in the world. So maybe identifying which things can actually be made more decentralized without having costly trade-offs might be an important area of research.
This is all this is so fascinating. It kind of makes me want to bring together a conference or something in which we actually name each one of these stages, because, catastrophic event, let's just say massive supervolcanic explosion. It's not totally impossible. And it's, it's in that case, we're kind of assuming there's no blame, which is important in terms of the nuclear winter scenario. There's a lot of potential blame involved, and that might really mess everything up. But, right after that event, you guys are kind of very early on, let's say, here, in terms of we need to survive that event. We need to make sure that humanity doesn't just go instantly extinct. And then, there's other organizations of people that I've been talking to, an incredible company called ARC, which is creating this technology that can survive, in which information can survive solar flares. They're basically etching incredibly vast amounts of information onto tiny disks made of quartz and, and putting them into space and stuff like that. And so that's much further down the line. And we just need to survive first, and then, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to add a thing there. That we at ALLFED, because you mentioned straight up extinction, right? There's also that, say, if a supervolcanic eruption has the potential, has the potential to reduce our, say, food production by up to 90%, or if we compare it to the worst case nuclear winter, there have been studies where it's 90% of global agriculture might be disrupted. But there are scenarios in which, say, 10% of global food production is disrupted. And we could see that already cascading a lot, because then there's not enough food to distribute anymore around the world. And so that could already lead to a lot of famines. And the solutions we are looking into would also be viable there, right? And then why it's important for me to add this, I guess an extinction risk, right? We can go into the definition of what a multiple breadbasket failure might be in a moment. But this could save hundreds of millions of people in such a scenario. And I think it's quite important that we have this capacity, globally speaking.
So tell me about that term, multiple breadbasket failure.
Yeah. So what is a multiple breadbasket failure? So let me first provide you with the definition and then maybe give a few examples. So a multiple breadbasket failure is a simultaneous disruption to key or to the largest agriculture production regions in the world due to concurrent shocks, or those areas experiencing concurrent shocks. So what might be an example? Extreme weather events, right? The risk due to climate change is increasing here, the probability of these events happening. So you could imagine, say, a drought over one continent or one key agriculture producer, maybe a flood over a second, forest fires over the third. And well, one thing we have seen last year is a war in Ukraine, right? Ukraine, for example, is a large exporter of wheat and grains, and that disrupted the supply chains as well. And if we would have had several coinciding events, that would have led to multiple breadbasket failures and easily could multiply our costs of food around the world several times. Yeah. And that would be devastating for a lot of people who can't afford it.
Okay. So this really is a kind of a part of that cascading model as well, where, you're seeing this toppling of the house of cards, and that metaphor that keeps coming up in my interviews. It's fascinating. And then like we had a great conversation with Dr. Sharada Krishnan, who is the director of programs for Crop Trust. And Crop Trust is responsible for the Svalbard Seed Bank. They're responsible for creating seed banks with local governments all over the world. And it's incredibly important in terms of preserving genetic diversity and helping bring back crops that are extinct. And they've already started to do that, in giant catastrophic scenarios. But it takes a long time. And having a handful of seeds is a lot different than having a huge amount of food that you can, already use and eat and distribute. So that I could see that readiness to retrofit, that word that you use, retrofitting our infrastructure in order to be pivoting towards making food is really important. And educating our leadership about, okay, you need to make sure that you could retain this capacity in order to survive one of these events. That's fascinating. And so just from an overview perspective, what if everything goes well, if everything goes really well for ALLFED and you guys are able to expand and you're able to take this to the greatest extent of your vision, what does that potentially look like? Are you creating centers across the planet that are doing this kind of research and implementing technologies with governments, or is this more? Are you really more of a research facility in order to educate and to create the concepts and the ideas and the technology, and then passing that along to bodies that can actually implement it? Or do you want to be the implementers?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So first of all, I want to quote one of our co-founders who always said, ALLFED is a think and do tank, which I really like. So as I mentioned earlier, achieving the mission of feeding everyone no matter what, we couldn't possibly do alone, right? That's a very ambitious goal. So we want to be at the forefront, inspire organizations and institutions to think about this problem and collaborate, right? And enable these efforts to prevent future famines. So how could a very successful future look like, right? By us partnering. And a thing I might want to add here, I think ALLFED has now members on each continent except Antarctica. So we're a remote working organization, remote working nonprofit, which makes scheduling fun. As we are already talking right now across continents, which is fascinating. But yeah, how does a positive future or a future in which ALLFED succeeded look like, right? So we've inspired and enabled policy makers across the globe acknowledge these risks, facilitate preparedness plans, and each country might have their own version, right? How they want to respond or who their first responders might be. Is the responsibility, say, with industries, with military, with firefighters? I personally don't know that at the moment, right? This could take several visions, but we would have surge capacity around the world, agreements around food export bans that people would not ban the export of food because it's clear, okay, yeah, we can produce enough. Even in the worst case scenarios, we are ready, right? That is also an important highlight, what we've shown that in the previous study that I mentioned, where they've shown that 90% of global agriculture could be disrupted in the worst case nuclear winter scenario. And that might lead to, say, 5 billion people dying. And our research has shown that doesn't have to be the case, right? There's a list of solutions, if implemented and collaborated. We don't have to go that route, right? There's a tremendous message of hope here and possibility. So yeah, in such a world, we would have good governance ready, because this is like a multifaceted problem, right? That we have like becoming ever better throughout history at solving, like how to make sure everyone in society has sufficient amounts of food. Yeah, and sorry, I lost overview of all the points I already
No,
mentioned.
this is great.
So it's like, in additionally, we also want like investments into these search capacities. To give maybe one concrete example, we've mentioned seaweed before, and to have like the biomass from which you can create these seaweed farms. So seaweed, in comparison to most land crops that we eat, they have spores, not seeds, which are like, I don't know, roughly like 100,000th of the size. So from very little fertile seaweed biomass, right, that you could have in a small hatchery, like several aquariums in which the spores are growing, could be deployed over a large area and then grow into huge seaweed farms over several weeks or potentially months. So that means having seaweed hatcheries at major coastlines across the globe might be a very resilient infrastructure that obviously can also be used to create a flourishing aquaculture industry today.
Do you have any, just because I'm curious, any knowledge on what a seaweed hatchery or farm like does to the ecosystem? You know, in the water, does it help the ecosystem? You know, that would be nice.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So this is not my area of expertise. We have one colleague in the team who also runs or has a seaweed startup. But there have been a lot of proposals also by the FAO, that's the Food and Agriculture Organizations, over several decades, highlighting the benefits of seaweed farms and other forms of aquaculture to create the so-called like blue economy. There's a lot of areas where seaweed farms are helping fishers to become farmers instead, basically, right? Like aquaculture farmers. So yeah, there are like, this is not my area of expertise, but I've seen several reports and suggestions how seaweed farms can clean up the oceans or be potentially carbon net negative, which is quite interesting. But obviously that depends on the implementation, and that is not something I have done a deep dive into. But to my knowledge, there's a lot of upside.
I might have to do a seaweed conference because I've heard about the carbon recapture. I've heard that it can clean the water, potentially regenerate ecosystems. And that's why I asked, though, because I'm not sure about that. I heard that if you can feed it to cows instead of normal feed, the cows don't produce methane anymore. And
that's correct.
You know, things like that. So maybe seaweed is the answer to a lot of our problems here. So I might have to look into that a bit more.
Seriously, I think that is the case, right? And if you just, I guess, look at it from like systematic or information perspective, just like aquaculture has a different risk profile than land-based agriculture. Therefore, just by diversifying where we get our nutrients from, we are less prone to one type of risk. And one could cover for the other, which is also, I guess, how our global food system works today, right? Like most famines that are happening today are in regions where there's war, because there's two things that are happening. There's a breakdown of markets, and human aid does not reach those regions. So, for example, the World Food Program is doing an important job. I think last year they supported the order of like 100 million people with food aid. So yeah, how did I get to that? Yes. Just an important thing to mention.
Yeah, that's perfect. And another important thing to mention for people that are listening is a lot people might be interested in understanding how they can get involved and how they could potentially contribute to the goal. You know, how do you feed the earth in disasters? So how can listeners get involved, learn more about ALLFED, potentially reach out to you or someone from your team if they have ideas or want to help or donate, give me the links. Where do you want to send people?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. So yeah, we at ALLFED, the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters, we have people from across the world working for us, contributing. Some are volunteering, some are donating, some are full-time researchers or helping us in operations. There's different roles, and we have been constantly growing over the last few years, slowly but steadily. And best ways to go to allfed.info and get in contact with us. There's a form, and that email will land right in, also in my inbox, but also in other colleagues, and then we see who's the best person to talk to you. So if you're be it applying for jobs, curious to volunteer, we had people doing their internships if they're still in their studies, or we have recently a hiring round for people doing their PhD. So with one of our co-founders, David Denkenberger, that's an opportunity. And opportunities like that might arise. So you can also just drop your email if you want to be included into our newsletter. So where we frequently update if we say have our next hiring round or an open role where people can apply to.
That's great. And I'll be sure to share that that link to that newsletter as well. And Aron, can people find you online or Twitter or anything like that? Are you around, or do you prefer to keep more private?
Less so there. I'm very happy to be added on LinkedIn. So yeah, I'm not that active yet on social media. Thinking more and more about doing that. I've been mostly lurking.
It does seem like a necessary evil, doesn't it? Sometimes.
I wouldn't even say evil. I guess. Well, it's a tool, and there are a lot of great people, and I'm always excited. Well, for opportunities like this, and that's how we also work at ALLFED.
Okay.
A completely remote working team.
Well, Aron, I can't thank you enough. This is so fascinating. I've got a feeling it's just the tip of the iceberg of the conversations that we're going to have.
Maybe if I want to add one thing here, just as an opportunity for listeners where this wasn't enough, our founder, David Denkenberger, together with a guest, Sahil Shah, or another colleague, they have been, for example, on another podcast, if that's called.
Please, absolutely.
To refer to another podcast, and that's the 80,000 Hours podcast. But there they talk for 3 to 4 hours and go way more into depth of the engineering challenges and what these solutions could look like. And a lot of more probabilities, more numbers. So if that's your kind of thing.
I can't recommend that podcast enough. That's actually how I found David. And in some ways, how I found you was through the 80,000 Hours podcast. So it's excellent. Definitely go check it out. And he's a great author. He's I haven't gotten to read his books yet, but it sounds super fascinating. So there it is. All right, nice. Which one is that?
So maybe a fun anecdote for your listeners. So this is a book one of our co-founders, David Denkenberger, wrote, I think in 2017, no, even earlier, I think 2015, would have to check. But Feeding Everyone No Matter What, where he outlines what ALLFED kind of has been doing for the first few years of really looking into resilient food solutions and how to approach that. And because the funny scenario was, or the origin story, David then read into a book where it's okay, if an asteroid that of the size that wiped out the dinosaurs would hit today, then everyone would die or everything would die, but only mushrooms would flourish in that kind of world, right? They don't require sun. They would feed off the dead leaves and the dead trees and whatnot. And David thought to himself, wait, why don't we eat the mushrooms and don't go extinct? Which kind of led to
I had to wear my mushroom shirt today out of respect for David. So, I'm a big fan.
I love it. But that led to the book, where then our second co-founder approached him. Together, they founded the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters. And several years down the line, this is where we are today. I think that's just kind of funny and great.
It's all things, no one wants to eat protein slime or just mushrooms or tree bark, but we want to be ready to do it if we have to. We got to survive. We've got to keep this spark of consciousness and life, and we're the stewards of the biosphere. We can let's keep this going, and let's find ways to do it.
Like, to be fair, like, that was my initial reaction as well, reading through the book. Oh, they're like, some of these solutions I would not be sure if I'm like, do I want to eat seaweed, for example? But actually, like, since starting that research, at every restaurant I had the chance, I ordered the dish with seaweed, just to like
Nice.
accustom myself. And well, it's about the balance, right? If we would still have like wheat, say we have single-celled protein and seaweeds, you could make like pasta out of it with like seaweed induced and have like some protein powder on top. I think you can still make great meals that don't have to be disgusting at all. And I think we can like
all right,
save a lot.
We're gonna put the ALLFED cookbook together. All right, it's gonna be all of the different sweet products you can make with seaweed and protein slime and wool, and stuff like that, protein powders. That'd be fun.
I would love to see that. I would love to see that.
We could do it. That'd be fun. Well, Aaron, thank you so much, man. I'm looking forward to speaking with you again, having more people from your team on, and yeah, we'll be in touch. Really appreciate it.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Thanks, Robert.